Okay, welcome to Lecture 13, which I'm going to try and make a little bit briefer than the last one because I went over time by about 6 or 7 minutes, and so I owe you some time back. So we'll see how I do with that. The next 4 lectures are going to focus on the political theory of Bentham's great successor in the utilitarian tradition, John Stuart Mill. We have, of course, already encountered Mill. We discussed his famous 1868 parliamentary speech on capital punishment in the last lecture, so he's not entirely new to you, but I want to spool back now after having given you that brief preview and reconstruct his particular version of classical utilitarianism, which, as you'll see, is very similar in lots of ways to Bentham's, but does introduce some important modifications. And so it's his views on utilitarianism itself that will be center stage this week. The following week, I will turn to his arguments on liberty, in which he attempts to, on a utilitarian basis, of course, defend various kinds of claims about what it means for individuals to enjoy an appropriate level of liberty in the modern world. Between these two discussions, I expect in the next lecture to say a few general things by way of an assessment of classical utilitarianism itself. So I'll respond a little bit on the utilitarian's behalf to several obvious objections to the utilitarian view, some of which I've already mentioned. Turning to Mill himself, he was certainly the most influential and, for my money, the most sophisticated and interesting of the 19th century utilitarians. There's a sense in which he couldn't have helped being a utilitarian because his father, James, who was originally from Scotland, became an associate and a disciple of Bentham himself. And so Mill was basically born into the milieu of figures who gathered themselves around Bentham at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And it was more or less inevitable, given his father's influence, that utilitarian ideas would loom very, very large in his formation. All the more so because notoriously James Mill subjected John Stuart to a rigorous utilitarian homeschooled education. I mean, it's almost as if James wanted his son John Stuart to be the kind of new utilitarian man. And so poor John Stuart was subjected to a relentless and incredibly ambitious program of tutoring and education from a very, very early age. So by the time he was 8, he was already reading Greek and Latin. He had mastered higher mathematics, algebra, calculus, Euclidean geometry in his early teens. And the result of all of this, he wasn't exactly a poster child, unfortunately, for homeschooling, and certainly not homeschooling of a strongly utilitarian kind. The result of all of this was that John Stuart Mill has a massive nervous breakdown at age 20 and goes through a fairly lengthy period of what we would today certainly call clinical depression. In his autobiography, from which I'll be quoting more in a moment, Mill talks extensively about this experience and says that his later reading of Coleridge's poem Dejection pretty much captures the mood he got himself into during this period of depression. Coleridge here is writing in that poem, he says, "A grief without a pang, void, dark and drear, a drowsy, stifled, unimpassioned grief, which finds no natural outlet or relief in word or sigh or tear." And it really was quite a deep depression. He certainly was suicidal for a period. He tries very hard to get himself out of it, but for a very long period, his efforts were in vain. The best anecdote in the autobiography about this is that he tries music, right? And he tries to kind of listen to music in the hope that that would kind of jolt him into better spirits. And it works for a little while, but then he notices that there's only a finite number of notes in a scale and probably even smaller finite number of possible aesthetically pleasing combinations of those notes. And so he reaches the conclusion, I mean, thinking, of course, very much like a utilitarian, calculating the number of possible happy combinations of chords and harmonies that are available. And he reaches the depressing conclusion that there must at some point be a stage at which all possible combinations of beautiful harmonies and sounds will have been discovered, and at that point music will go out of existence because we'll have discovered all the music that there is to make, and so he falls back into depression. So it gives us a account of a series of attempts to get out of it, and he doesn't succeed. Eventually he does, and I'll talk a little bit about what he learns from the experience in a moment, because I think it's quite important for understanding why he breaks with Bentham, at least on certain points. As I said, he was more or less primed to be a utilitarian because he was, dumped right from an early age into this kind of cultural soup. So he unconsciously imbibed utilitarian sensibilities virtually from the start. But apart from that, it certainly seems that Mill himself was directly very inspired by his initial encounter with Bentham. He reads Bentham for the first time in his teens, and he describes this as a formative experience. He feels as if he's found his purpose in life, the cause to which he wants to devote himself. Mill writes in the autobiography that upon reading Bentham at this time in his life, he says, "I had what might truly be called an object in life for the first time, to be a reformer of the world." And again, that speaks to something that I mentioned in the last lecture, which is very, very important. Don't think of Bentham and Mill as dry as dust philosophers or academicians. They think of themselves as engaged reformers, people who want to make a difference in the world. And Mill himself, as you know from last lecture, was for a brief period in his life a parliamentary MP. So these are people who think of themselves as actively engaged in public life, not withdrawing into a kind of intellectual contemplation. But his nervous breakdown in his 20s convinces him that there's something wrong with the way Bentham approached utilitarian ideas. And in particular, he becomes convinced that Bentham understood utilitarianism in too mechanical a way. He basically treats human beings as if they're machines, with levers to push and pull by using sanctions. And this is the feature of Bentham's view that Mill finds upon experiencing clinical depression that he can't fully identify with, and therefore concludes that we need to modify the utilitarian view. What are the features of Bentham's view that he rejects? The main one, and he cites this in the remarks on Bentham's philosophy, which I don't think I assigned, but which are in your Troyer reader if you're interested. They're right at the very end. So I'm going to quote a few passages from that. Again, it's not part of the assignment, but if you're curious, you can certainly take a look at it. It's a fairly easy read. The basic problem that Mill sees in Bentham's view upon reflection is that he has this very primitive, in Mill's view of human psychology as being fundamentally activated by selfishness, and selfishness understood in a rather crude and rudimentary form. So the program of social reform that Bentham is continually talking about primarily focuses on using and manipulating self-interested incentives, especially those at the disposal of the political system and by means of legal punishment, to try to goad, cajole, deter, compel, oblige people to behave in their own self-interest in ways that conduce to overall welfare. And he disapprovingly quotes a remark of Bentham. He quotes a number of others, but this is perhaps the clearest. He disapprovingly quotes Bentham's remark in the Book of Fallacies that in every human breast, self-regarding interest is predominant over social interest. And Mill explicitly says, and again you can find this in the Troyer reading, or the Troyer Anthology, page 266, by the promulgation of such views of human nature, I conceive Mr. Bentham's writings to have done and to be doing very serious evil. And I think we get a few clues about how Mill wants to modify Benthamite utilitarianism by thinking just a little bit about what actually lifted him out of this dark, nervous breakdown, this clinical depression that he suffers in his 20s. And in the autobiography, Mill says that he begins his recovery. I mean, it's aided later on by reading Wordsworth and poetry and so forth. But the turning point, he says, was when he read the memoir of this French historian, Marmontel. Marmontel was a French man of letters, primarily a historian, but he also wrote plays, he wrote librettos for operas, he was a musical commentator, something of a Renaissance man. But in the memoir, Marmontel talks about, the death of his father, and he reads this and he bursts into tears. And this convinces him that after all, there's a beating, passionate heart within him. And this begins to sort of slowly lift him out of his depression. This is the way Mill puts it. From this moment, his reading of Marmontel, my burden grew lighter. The oppression of the thought that all feeling was dead within me was gone. I was no longer hopeless. I was not a stock or a stone. I had still, it seemed, some of the material out of which all worth of character and all capacity for happiness are made. And what his reading of Marmontel basically does is to put him back in touch with his emotions. I mean, as any of you who have suffered at all from clinical depression will know, one of the characteristic symptoms of depression is a syndrome that the psychologists call anhedonia, right? A lack of interest or a lack of engagement with the things that you would normally find enjoyable, right? So you kind of become unmoored from your normal emotional constitution, right? And things don't matter to you anymore in quite the same way. You don't find things that used to be enjoyable to you, then they cease to be enjoyable, and things that used to make you cry don't make you cry anymore, right? Your emotional life is kind of flattened out, and that seems to be exactly what Mill goes through, and it's Marmontel that he credits with jolting him out of this. And he goes on to describe the slow, laborious period of recovery, and he says something at the end of all of this that I think is, and I hope this will become clear in the later lecture, that is, I think, very, very important for understanding his views about how to interpret utilitarianism and why he dissented from Bentham's view and what he replaced Bentham's view with. Mill says, again, this is from the autobiography, the experiences of this period and his recovery from depression led me to adopt a theory of life, mark that term, theory of life, I'll come back to it, very unlike that on which I had before acted, and having much in common with what at that time I certainly had never heard of, the anti-self-consciousness theory of Carlyle. I never indeed wavered in the conviction that happiness is the test of all rules of conduct and the end of life, so he remains a loyal utilitarian in that sense. But I now thought that this end was only to be attained by not making it the direct end. Those only are happy, I thought, who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, people find happiness by the way, right? I mean, what Mill is kind of foreshadowing here is a thought that many of us will have had about human motivation and its sometimes paradoxical quality. If you think about falling asleep, right? I mean, how do you, if you're having trouble getting to sleep, right? The worst thing that you can possibly do is to adopt as your aim, I'm going to try to fall asleep now, right? Because if you self-consciously try to fall asleep, all you're going to be doing is prolonging consciousness, right? And what you're trying to do is to end consciousness. What you're trying to do is to let go and let your body of itself fall asleep. So, one very good way of overcoming insomnia, as many of you will know, is to stop worrying about not being able to fall asleep and distract your attention elsewhere. This is why turning on the radio or listening to a book on tape is a very good way to overcome insomnia, because you turn on the radio, you listen to a book on tape, and your attention is engaged by the story. And if you're physiologically exhausted enough, gradually your body will just fall asleep naturally. But that's not going to happen if you try to fall asleep and continuously get frustrated that you're not able to fall asleep. There's a self-defeating quality to the conscious effort to fall asleep. And Mill, as you can see there, reaches the conclusion that something of the same syndrome applies to the conscious pursuit of happiness. In many cases, if you want to be a happy person and lead a joyful life, the one thing you mustn't do is to directly take as your aim to be happy, because if you do that, you will defeat the object. It'll sabotage itself, and that's the conclusion that he draws. Not that Bentham was wrong to claim that happiness is the end of our activities. He agrees with Bentham about that. So Mill doesn't reject utilitarianism, but he does conclude that the Benthamite approach to it has to be modified. And it has to be modified in order to take seriously what he'd mentioned in that quote I read from the autobiography, what we might call the ideal regarding character of much real human motivation. And this is the reason why Mill, in the early chapters of his essay Utilitarianism, which we're focusing on this week, that's why Mill develops this doctrine of what he calls the higher pleasures. And Mill devotes several pages to answering an objection that in fact had been made to utilitarianism by Carlyle himself, that utilitarianism is a pig philosophy. Pig philosophy is the word or the term that Carlyle used. Carlyle isn't actually directly mentioned in Mill's text, but Mill does talk about the objection as complaining that utilitarianism is a doctrine worthy only of swine. So he's clearly thinking of Carlyle's objection and signaling to readers who know of Carlyle's writings that's the person he's responding to. And as I read Mill's argument in this section of utilitarianism, I think it's pretty clear, especially viewed in the context of his other disapproving remarks about the Benthamite approach, that Mill thinks that there is something to Carlyle's charge if it's directed against the Benthamite version of utilitarianism. So Mill thinks that the pig philosophy objection probably works against Benthamite utilitarianism, but it doesn't necessarily work against all plausible or sophisticated versions of utilitarianism. And so what he's trying to do in responding to Carlyle's argument about utilitarianism just being worthy of swine, he's trying to develop an account of what he calls the higher pleasures to give a better account of utilitarianism that's able to evade this kind of charge and show that in order to be utilitarian, you don't have to have this very low view of human beings as actuated only by really rudimentary, almost animal-like motives of pleasure and pain. It's important to be clear about exactly what Mill is objecting to in Bentham, though. Mill knew perfectly well and acknowledged that Bentham had a fairly sophisticated moral psychology, and I talked about this in the last lecture. Bentham doesn't think of us simply as beings who are only motivated by direct physical arousal, but by direct physical sensations, like the burning pain you feel when you stick your hand in a fire. He understood that the sources of pain and pleasure that constitute his sanctions are heterogeneous, and that they include moral feelings like sympathy for other people, and negative feelings like guilt, right? And Mill understood perfectly well that Bentham recognized that those kinds of feelings ought to play a role in the utilitarian view. So it's not so much that Mill was unaware that Bentham had a fairly sophisticated and capacious understanding of the kind of range of human moral psychology and the kinds of feelings that give rise to pain and pleasure. What I think Mill is really concerned about is the attitude toward those feelings, heterogeneous and diverse though they are, that he thinks Bentham promoted. Right? The thought, I take it, is that Mill is worried that Bentham simply views these feelings as goads. Right? They're simply sources of discomfort and pleasure that motivate and answer to self-interested individuals. Right? I mean, in effect, what I think Mill is saying here, I'm going to put this in somewhat anachronistic terms by talking about a thinker who comes much later in the 20th century, this behaviorist psychologist, B.F. Skinner, whom many of you will have read or encountered in other classes. B.F. Skinner had this view about what he called operant conditioning, and he wanted to say that you could develop an empirical psychology that would figure out how, by using various, as Skinner put it, negative and positive reinforcement techniques, you can condition human behavior in ways that will be beneficial to them and beneficial to everybody else. And in effect, I think what Mill is complaining about in Bentham, although of course he couldn't have put it in these terms because he's never read any Skinner, because Skinner wasn't writing until the 20th century, long after Mill has died. But still, I think it's a useful way to think of it. He worries that Bentham treats moral psychology and the sanctions of pleasure and pain in much the way that B.F. Skinner would later understand negative and positive reinforcement. Skinner is famous for, perfecting all of these techniques of operant conditioning that he used on pigeons and rats. He figured out that you could, by providing rewards to rats in a maze, you could get them to, figure out how to get out of the maze. Or you can, go to a kids' science museum and, every 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, they'll have a little show where they've got rats, jumping over fences and hoops and doing somersaults and performing all kinds of tricks. And how do you get them to do that? Well, B.F. Skinner, following some ideas of Pavlov and others, you can do that by rewarding certain kinds of behavior, right? You can give them bits of cheese, or you can, in the negative case, you can give them electric shocks if you're trying to condition them not to behave in certain kinds of ways. And Mill's basic worry about Bentham is to say that it's a mistake to think, as Bentham did, that a rational attitude to our pleasures and pains is simply like that of rats responding to electric shocks and cheese in a B.F. Skinner behaviorist psychological experimental setup. That's not the right way to understand how human beings are related to the pleasures and pains that activate them. Our moral psychology is more sophisticated and subtle and complicated than that. And that's what the higher pleasures argument in Mill's essay is supposed to be all about. These higher pleasures, as he calls them, are, Mill thinks, the most important and consequential forms of pleasure available to human beings. They're the ones that he thinks really matter for our happiness, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And if one wanted to kind of give a sort of general categorization of what these higher pleasures are like for Mill, I would say that Mill has a conception of them as pleasures that are aspirational in character, right? That's why I use the language of ideal regarding, right? They're pleasures that arise from a distinctively human propensity to invest themselves in aspirations and ideals, right? And this is something that he thinks Bentham has missed and doesn't take seriously enough, because he's continually tempted, Bentham, to reduce moral psychology just to a kind of machine-like game in which people are trying to avoid certain disincentives and realize certain incentives, right? But there's more to human beings than that, and that, as I've said, is what Mill takes away from his nervous breakdown. What are these higher pleasures? Can we be a little bit more specific about what Mill has in mind? Well, he says a number of things about it, which I think are interesting. One is that Mill says at several points, but at one point in the essay on utilitarianism in particular, he says that our interest in these higher pleasures is linked to a sense of our dignity as human beings, right? That certain kinds of activities are worthy of our humanity and others are unworthy of our humanity, right? And he uses the language of dignity to characterize that kind of connection. He has in mind pleasures that are associated especially with intellectual activity, research, philosophy, reflection on our place in a scientifically understood universe. He also has in mind artistic and aesthetic activity, the writing and consumption of works of art, whether they be poems. Mill's very engaged, as you can already see, by poems, or music, or the visual arts, literature. These are all aspects of human activity in which Mill's higher pleasures are implicated. Philanthropic activity, the desire to do something, to give something back, to promote some valuable social project, whether it's Mothers Against Drunk Driving or Oxfam, or giving money to your favorite university or program. That's another kind of activity that Mill would regard as a site of the higher pleasures. Sometimes, because of the examples that Mill uses, and the examples I've all used so far would perhaps invite this charge, sometimes critics notice that there's a certain elitist character to the kinds of things that Mill seems to have in mind. He tends very often to be thinking of the sorts of things that you study at a very high-end university like UVA or Princeton or Harvard or Uppsala or one of these places, right? And so this tends to attract a kind of charge that Mill is just a kind of upper middle class snob who thinks that, who's just trying to build into utilitarianism a certain kind of pretentious bourgeois attitude about the value of higher learning and things like that, and he doesn't take seriously other kinds of things, and that it's biased in a certain elitist direction. And I've always found that charge to be a little bit unfair, because I think it's pretty clear from the text, although he doesn't say this explicitly, that the range of things that would count as higher pleasures in his view would include a great deal of other things that wouldn't attract a charge of elitism, right? So, seeking sporting achievement, right? Pursuing a hobby, raising a family, even simply, being taking pride in your work as a plumber or as a mechanic or something like that, doing it very well. All of these things, I think, would be aspirational in the relevant sense. They're all ideal regarding, because they would all enable a person to take a certain kind of pride in what they've accomplished or done. And I think it's unfair, a little bit anyway, to use some of Mill's own examples against him and just assume too complacently that he's only thinking of things that have a slightly kind of snobbish, white male, Victorian bourgeois kind of character to it. I mean, there's certainly something of that flavor that comes out of the text. But if you dig behind the examples and think about what he's really talking about, I think it's pretty clear that he means something that is broader than just that. He also connects the higher pleasures with passion, right, and emotion, right? So love, loyalty, duty to virtue, self-perfection, the unstinting pursuit of ideals for their own sake. These are all things that Mill would include under his general heading of the higher pleasures. And this is, of course, what leads him to his famous little aphorism that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, right? And I want you to notice a couple of things about that formulation. It's a very famous formulation, and precisely because it's famous and because it sort of rolls off the tongue, it's very neat and a nice little clipped aphorism, it's easy to miss some of its features. But the first thing I want you to notice about it is that Mill is conceding, right, that the pursuit of these higher pleasures will often result in disappointment. You won't necessarily achieve what it is that you set out to achieve, right? You may often be dissatisfied, right? You may not accomplish what you intend to accomplish. But his point is that in the case of these higher pleasures, the failure to achieve a goal is not necessarily what matters, right? And what's important about this is that Mill, I think, is trying to get across that the pursuit of higher pleasures is more about striving, right? It's more about the experience of giving yourself to a cause or a project than it is about actually the fulfillment or satiation of a particular kind of goal. The pleasure that he's talking about consists as much, if not more, in the activity of seeking whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, not in the fulfillment or disappointment of the achievement itself. So the kind of aspirational activity that he's thinking about doesn't have a straightforward logic of satiation, right? I aim to avoid this pleasure. I aim to avoid this pain. I aim to achieve this pleasure, right? I mean, that's for him true of a lot of lower pleasures, right? If I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, I experience a certain kind of dissatisfaction, a certain kind of discomfort. What do I do about it? I go get a drink, I go and eat, right? And I remove the discomfort and I've satiated my desire, right? And that's the structure that Mill thinks is typical of what he implicitly is thinking of when he's thinking of the lower pleasures. But he's flagging that the higher pleasures have a different logic. It's not so important that the ends are achieved. What's important is the actual procedure. It's the actual striving after the end that is the source of the pleasure. You know, some of you, again, to make a link to psychology, some of you will have taken classes in the psychology department in which the psychology of welfare and happiness, which has become a kind of hot topic again in the last 20 years among psychologists, is discussed. And as you may know, one of the going theories of happiness in 21st century psychology is this conception of happiness as flow, right? This is associated with a psychologist with an impossibly complicatedly spelt, I think it's a Hungarian name, but something like Csikszentmihalyi, and he's one of the great proponents and conceptualizers of this idea of flow, and the idea is that, you know, when we're really absorbed in an activity, right, when we're totally focused, we're at one with ourselves in trying to achieve something, we're so completely wrapped up in what we're doing that's one of the ways in which human beings experience a particularly valuable form of contentment and happiness. And in a way, the value of flow in that sense is independent of the question of whether you achieve what it is that you set out to achieve. The enjoyment, the pleasure is taken in the absorption itself. And Mill, I think, is taking account of that in his pursuit of the higher pleasures. So it's more about striving than satiation. But at the same time, notice that it remains a utilitarian view for Mill. What's important about these activities is still the experiential quality of one's life, right? So he's not trying to say that these aspirations are valuable for human beings independently of the quality of life as they experience it. What's important about flow, if that's what we're talking about, is what it's like to be flowing, right? To be channeled, to be completely absorbed, right? It's still an experiential thing, right? So Mill's point is that while the higher pleasures involve activity and striving and something like flow, his point is that the experience of those forms of absorption, they contribute more to happy experience. They make more of a difference to our overall happiness than merely bodily pleasures or merely satiable pleasures or easily satiable pleasures. So if you put those two things together, I think you'll begin to see that Mill's understanding of the higher pleasures gives him some resources for responding to a very famous objection to classical utilitarianism, which was formulated in 1974 by Robert Nozick in a book called Anarchy, State and Utopia. And Nozick is a strong critic of utilitarianism. And one of the ways in which he criticizes utilitarianism is that it focuses too much on experience. And he tries to convince us that experience isn't really what matters, and therefore that utilitarianism is wrong. And to do this, he comes up with this incredibly powerful philosophical thought experiment, sometimes called the experience machine. He says, well, imagine that we had a machine, right, that you could plug into this machine, and all the time you'd actually just be a brain in a vat, right? You're not really doing anything. You're just, we plug wires into your neurons, and we can program this machine to give you any experience you want, right? If you want to fall in love, if you want to write the great American novel, if you want to experience what it's like to be the first person to conquer Everest, if you want to know what it's like to win the presidency or something, you can program that experience into the machine, and you can have that experience, right? Nozick says none of us would rationally plug into this machine because the machine only gives us simulacra of happiness. And we're not really active in the machine. We're just passive, and we're just receiving these experiences. And he thinks this is a decisive objection to utilitarianism because he charges that utilitarians care only about experience and therefore can't really account for the value of activity and throwing yourself into things and living an active life of aspiration and project pursuit, and moreover doing so in a way that is authentic, right? That isn't just a simulation, right? It matters to us that when I say to somebody, I love you, and they say, I love you too back, it matters to me that the person saying that back to me is a real person, not some simulation, right? And Nozick thinks that that's a real problem for utilitarianism because utilitarianism is utilitarianism emphasizes experience all the time. But I think if you look carefully at Mill's account of the higher pleasures, there are at least some resources that he makes available to utilitarians wishing to respond to that kind of objection, because it's fairly clear that Mill is talking here about certain pleasures that are only available to people if they are trying actively to do things. And it's in the trying, it's in the striving that we find the pleasure. And of course, it matters that the striving is about something real rather than simulated, right? Now, I'm not suggesting here that Mill's argument is a decisive response to Nozick's experience machine example, but I think it gives you the beginning of a line of response, and it's worth thinking about. So here are some other ways of capturing Mill's idea here about the higher pleasures. Imagine that you remained like a 6-year-old all of your life, right? Well, so you have, 6-year-old infantile desires to eat chocolate all the time, or to have stupid toys that go bing, to see your dad bang into a door and hurt his nose and go, fuck! 6-year-olds love seeing that sort of thing. They think it's great. And your only desires in life are like that. There's fairly low low-grade, infantile, 6-year-old desires. Suppose you got to stay like that throughout your 70 years, throughout your 70 years and 10, right? You remained like a 6-year-old all your life. Those are the only desires that actuate you, but they're fully satisfied. So for 75 years or whatever it is, all of your desires to have stupid toys that go ping and eat chocolate all the time, they'll be fully satisfied, right? But Mill's question for you would then be, could you describe a person who only has those desires, even if they're all completely satisfied over 75 years, could you really describe that person as fully happy? And as fully happy as a human being could be. And Mill is betting that his higher pleasures argument will convince you that you wouldn't be fully satisfied with that, and you shouldn't be fully satisfied with that. Or suppose, Woody Allen's movie Sleeper. It's not actually a very good movie, but it does have this interesting idea. There's this machine called, a bit like Nozick's experience machine, actually. Woody Allen's film has this device called an orgasmatron, and you can just, it's like a kind of, big big water heater, basically, and you climb in, you press a button, and it gives you an orgasm, right? Now, I mean, if you lived your life in which your only source of satisfaction was entering the orgasmatron, right? I mean, that was always available to you, and you had what was effectively, 70 years of a series of orgasms, right? I mean, you might say, well, look, this would be very intense, be great, but Mill would say you'd miss out on an awful lot of the key ingredients in actual human happiness, right? Yeah, you'd have a lot of pleasurable sensation, right? But there's more to human happiness than mere pleasurable sensation. And that's what his higher pleasures argument is supposed to bring out. Mill says that people who've experienced both, they've had a lot of orgasms, they've had a lot of 6-year-old eating chocolate, playing with toys that go ping and so forth, and who've pursued the higher pleasures, he thinks that people who've experienced both of these kinds of pleasures will tend to come back and say, well, the higher pleasures, what Mill is calling the higher pleasures, they in the end matter more for whether my life has been a good and happy life than the other kind, right? So he uses this sort of argument to provide sort of circumstantial evidence for the claim that the sorts of things that he's classifying as higher pleasures are indeed worth more from the point of view of maximizing individual happiness than are his implicitly lower pleasures, right? Keep in mind, as you think about this argument, that Mill's competent judges, those who've tried both and report a considered preference for the higher pleasures, they're not denying that higher pleasures are often far less intense than certain lower pleasures. They're not necessarily saying that, reading a great book of poetry and being moved by it and embarking on some project of philanthropy, right? That this is a source of such intense pleasure as, say, eating an absolutely delicious dessert, right? He's not saying that at all, because, as you know from Bentham, intensity of pleasure is, even for Bentham, just one among several dimensions along which pleasures and pains can be computed, right? The claim that the competent judges are really making, and that Mill is making, is that the extent to which your life overall is joyful and fulfilled turns much more on your access to higher pleasures than on the satisfaction of desires for lower forms of arousal, as Mill would describe them, right? It's a claim about what is more important for the achievement of something like a happy life. And Mill's view is that more turns on the higher pleasures for human happiness than other kinds of pleasures. Notice, too, that on Mill's account, the absence of higher pleasures is not itself necessarily painful, right? I mean, our eternal 6-year-old who lives, with 6-year-old desires fully satisfied, his fool satisfied, right, for his full 70 years and 10, right? I mean, that person doesn't necessarily experience very much pain, right? Because, they live 70 odd years of, enjoyably eating chocolate, playing with stupid toys and all the rest of it, right? So he's not saying that the absence of higher pleasures is necessarily itself a source of pain. His point is, I think, that foregoing higher pleasures has a much, much higher opportunity cost in terms of your overall well-being than foregoing lower pleasures does. Right? That's the kind of claim that he's making. And so therefore, implicitly, he's saying that the higher pleasures contribute proportionately more to our sum total of human happiness over the course of a lifetime than do any pleasure we derive from implicitly lower forms of desire. Let me make a couple of concluding points about Mill's higher pleasures argument, and we'll leave it there for today. Mill includes in the higher pleasures very clearly the cultivation of moral virtue for its own sake. Right? Acquiring the disposition to want to act rightly and to perfect one's moral character for its own sake, that Mill thinks is one of the things that we ought to try to achieve, and it is a source of higher pleasure. And again, it's a source of higher pleasure whether or not we actually fully realize our character ideals. Because the activity of trying to be a good person, trying to perfect our character for its own sake, is in and of itself satisfying, Mill thinks. And you should remember here that remark that I quoted from the autobiography about the indirect quality of the pursuit of happiness, right? So this is an example, right? Mill, in his discussion of cultivating virtue for its own sake, it connects directly up with what he says in his autobiography about the self-effacing quality of happiness. It turns out that if you're going to be happy, you want to be unself-conscious about trying to be happy. Instead, you should invest yourself in other things like virtue for its own sake, or other higher pleasures like the pursuit of art for its own sake, or the pursuit of aesthetic beauty for its own sake, or some philanthropic project, or some plan of benevolent reformism for your society, right? It turns out paradoxically that you will be happier, your life will be richer in human pleasures, to the extent that you forget about happiness as such and invest yourself fully and wholeheartedly in these virtues for their own sake. And that's the way the higher pleasures argument is supposed to work. Notice, moreover, that the higher pleasures argument is not, I think, relevant to the actuarial calculation of overall welfare, right? I mean, if you treat what Mill says about the higher pleasures argument as being something that is relevant to how we compute aggregate welfare, you will immediately run into a big problem because, of course, Mill explicitly says, well, look, the whole point of my higher pleasures argument is to say that some pleasures are superior not only in terms of quantity of happiness, but in terms of quality. So his higher pleasures argument is supposed to be an argument for the qualitative as well as quantitative status of the higher pleasures, right? And of course, if you try to plug that into the formula that utilitarians use for calculating overall welfare, then you get a really messy picture because somehow you're supposed to be, calculating quantities of welfare across people, and then we're also supposed to be taking into account qualitative pleasure, and then that makes a mess of the whole idea of a utilitarian calculus itself. But I don't think Mill ever intended his higher pleasures argument to be relevant to the calculative side of the utilitarian story. As he says, and as the passage from the autobiography says early on, he describes this account of the higher pleasures as a theory of life. And what he means by a theory of life is a vision that individuals ought themselves to adopt as a kind of set of ideals to strive for in their own activity. So what the higher pleasures argument is not supposed to be an argument about how we calculate aggregate welfare. It's supposed to be a view about what theory of life we should ourselves take on. And the idea, I take it, is that we should care about the higher pleasures for their own sake. We should care about virtue for its own sake. Okay, I have to stop there because I'm at 50 minutes and I promised I'd try to be shorter than 50 minutes. I did have one other thing to say. I haven't quite managed to say it, but I'll fold it into the next lecture and I will stop here for now. Thank you.